So I think it's 2 or 3 years since I last talked about MyMelanoma. Back then it was an aspiration, as is the page change. Okay, it's not on the computer, it's on the clicker. And what we're aiming to do is to get 20,000 of you involved in research. I work mostly down at the Churchill Hospital in Oxford on phase 1 trials, where a big trial is about 30 or 40 people. So this is a huge departure for me. I think before I started getting involved in MyMelanoma, I might have involved 1,000 people in trials over the whole of my career. And this started with Imogen and with a chap called Sean Guinness, who's a patient of Julia Newton-Bishop's, and asking themselves, well, what can we do to help other melanoma patients besides events like this? And how can we make research accessible to everybody, irrespective of where they are? If you live in Oxford, that's great. There's an academic centre with trials coming out of its ears, and you can go and access that. But what if you live somewhere miles away? My wife's family all come from Devon, and the nearest medical school, until they built one in Exeter and Plymouth for many years, was you had to go all the way up to Bristol, so a 2-3 hour journey just to get there and hope they might be interested in what you had. So MyMelanoma was conceived as a way of bringing research to patients rather than asking patients to come to the research. And we started it expressly digitally, because that seemed the most effective way of getting research to people. And the idea was not, lots talked about digitization. It's one of what's called the 3 shifts in the NHS 10-year plan to go from analog to digital. But this isn't just about doing what we're already doing digitally, but about really trying to exploit the power of digital so that we can do clinical trials differently and do trials that we couldn't do previously, partly because of cost, and that's easy to sort out, but also because it opens up new possibilities. And one of the key things there is to reduce the burden on participants. Because if it's hard work getting into a clinical trial, then immediately the people who are in a clinical trial don't tell you very much about what a new treatment, for example, is going to do once it hits the real world. And we found that, for example, with BRAF inhibitors, where the people who are on the clinical trials behave very, very differently from people in real life once the drugs were licensed and we could use them in a slightly free and easy way. Nothing's ever free and easy in the NHS with the rules that NICE puts us under. But for example, just a simple one was that twice as many people would come off treatment for side effects with BRAF and then MEK inhibitors in real life as would in the clinical trial. So immediately thinking about cost effectiveness, turns out BRAF inhibitors are quite a lot cheaper than we'd anticipated when trying to persuade NICE to fund them. So that's the sort of thing that you can do if you do it differently. And so this is all online. In your packs, there's some details about that. And I'll pop a QR code up at the end, if you haven't already accessed MyMelanoma, where you can see how you might take part. It's all driven by the participant. So there's information online. If you sign up, there's a bunch of questionnaires. We ask for permission to access your medical records, because we know that if we go and ask the regular care teams for access to your medical records, they're far too busy to do that for us. And so the idea is to take advantage of what in the UK is a fantastic resource. It's centralized cancer registration data, not just saying who's got cancer and what type, but how they've been treated. We can get access to what pictures have been taken. Sounds a little bit spooky, but believe me, we're doing it for the right reasons, and you can say no if you're part of MyMelanoma. And it allows us, therefore, to look at things in detail, and particularly now that we've got automated systems for pulling information out and making sense of it from free text and so forth, means that we can make sensitivity at a scale that simply isn't possible through clinical trials without spending tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. What we've also started to do is think of ways in which we can take samples. We piloted using saliva samples to look at DNA in people with familial melanoma. We've also got little bolt-on leeches, they're plastic things that can take a very small amount of blood with a very fine needle that goes through the skin and takes it from the capillaries, so not like having to access a vein, that people can apply at home, and then they take it off and they send the kit back to us, and we can look at blood that way. And we've got a pilot of that running at the moment. And we can ask you how you're getting on with your treatment, what your experience of treatment is like. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on quality of life and how you experience treatments and care, but most of that is gathered in clinical trials and is really quite misleading about the realities of being on treatment once that treatment becomes part of routine. And we've also got an eye on the future, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well in a minute. But the idea is to build a database of the information that people are willing to let us have about their treatment and care, and start to draw conclusions from that, which we can't do in our typical trials of a dozen or a few dozen or a few hundred patients, and answer some of the questions also that are important to our participants, rather than the questions that are important to people like me who live in an ivory tower and have their head somewhere I won't mention. Okay, so the key message with this, though, is to put the power back in the hands of the participants. You decide how much you'd like to participate. You decide how far down that list you go with the participation, and you're in control and you can change that. But the reason we're doing this is because if we can get 20,000 people involved in various levels of involvement, there are a whole bunch of questions that we can start to answer that aren't currently answerable in clinical trials. And they're the sorts of questions that you've asked your doctors when you come to clinic, and that I get asked in clinic every week, which is, why did this, the why did this happen to me questions. They're the what can I do about it now questions, which are super hard to answer because drug trials are really easy. If I've got new drug X and I want to see whether having that makes things better than not, well, I can be pretty sure that you can't get hold of new drug X other than through me and my clinical trial, because drugs are pretty well controlled. But if I want to understand whether large amounts of red wine prevents melanoma from coming back, that's a little bit more difficult to control and to pick out. But we're also helped by the fact that the UK's worked really hard at this sort of study. We've had things like the UK Biobank with 500,000 people. We've got the Million Women study, which I think I'll leave you to work out how many women were involved in that. We've got Our Future Health recruiting at the moment, which aims to get 5 million people before they become unwell and track them through to the illnesses they get in later life. And with all of that, we've got all sorts of questionnaires, which we've shamelessly nicked for our project, by the way, precisely so that we can compare people with melanoma with people in health and ask questions like, what lifestyle factors mitigate the risk of melanoma coming back, which ones don't matter, how can we give you better information about how to avoid melanoma recurrence, how to avoid it in the first place, and so forth. And we also want to study some things that we've been hopelessly bad at studying. Having a cancer diagnosis, having a melanoma diagnosis changes you, changes how you behave. And we don't necessarily pay too much attention to that. And that's something that I think we would really like to understand by asking people directly, well, how do you think it's changed you? And using the help of questionnaires to try to unpick that. So by doing this at a larger scale, we can start to answer some questions that have previously been out of reach. But the other thing that we're really interested in doing is saying, well, okay, well, what should those questions be? So, and I'll show you a little bit of data, because we started to do this towards the end of last year, to say, well, okay, well, fine, I know what I think is interesting, but, frankly, I'm a bit weird. I've been doing this for 30-odd years. I've got lots of biases to do with this, partly driven by, I can only answer questions that people will give me money and grants to answer. So, my perspective is really quite skewed now. And so we want to be able to make this interactive and ask our community, well, is this important or not? And not to embark upon any research of any significance without really checking in first with people and saying, well, does this matter? And I think that becomes particularly important if we start to take money from people to help to answer these questions. We don't want to take money from anybody, and we don't want to take money other than if it's going to help us to answer a question which our community thinks is important. So where have we got to? Well, we're 3/4 of the way there now. This is up-to-date information from the beginning of this month. We've got nearly 15,500 participants signed up. And that's been driven to a huge extent by being a digital exemplar with NHS England for digital recruitment into clinical trials. We won the right to write to everybody in England, because unfortunately health is devolved. I say unfortunately, that's not a comment on devolution, it's just a comment on our ability to access people around the country. We could only write to people in England because this is NHS England, not NHS UK. So we could write to everybody with a melanoma diagnosis in the UK and invite them to take part. So many of you will have received letters. The first thing we learned is that the coding in the NHS database is not perfect. And actually, we learned about a potential harm. One of the ways, we scared quite a few people. Because if you go and have something chopped off and they think it's melanoma, somebody might put a melanoma code on your record provisionally, and then when it's not, as is usually the case when something gets chopped, they didn't clear it. And so you get a letter from me going, really, you might be interested in this research. They go, but I had this chopped off and it wasn't melanoma. That's obviously really provokes a lot of anxiety. And some people got very cross with me because my name was on the bottom of the letter. But the other thing we did very carefully so that I couldn't see into people's records until they gave me permission to do so is we literally didn't know who we were writing to. So we handed over a bunch of money and letters to NHS England, who handed over to a third party. We had permission from what's called the Clinical Advisory Group, which is a group that signs off on research that starts without taking consent from people. All we asked for was permission to write to them. So I didn't know who we were writing to. We wrote to 170,000 people. And the upshot of this is we changed our letters partway through. Instead of saying, we think you might be able to help with this research because you've got melanoma, we think you might have melanoma. And if that's true, then you can participate in our research. So at the end of last year, so these numbers don't quite add up, this is where we got people from. You can see that because of devolution and not writing, just by natural recruitment and word of mouth, we've got a few people in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and then a much larger group of people around England, which by and large maps onto population density. So it's not that people in the southeast were more inclined to sign up, it's just the number's bigger because there's a lot more people living in the southeast. And if we think about what that means from a melanoma point of view, the pie chart at the bottom there shows that most people are in stage 1 and stage 2, which reflects the incidence of melanoma by stage. And then out of that 15,000, this is a cut from the end of last year, so it's a little bit less than the number we have in now. Just over half of people completed all our questionnaires. And thank you to those of you who have. We know it's quite arduous. It takes quite a bit of time. You can leave it and come back. And not everybody gets to the end, and that's fine. And then thinking particularly about the experience on treatment and immunotherapy, our new kid on the block, then it's about just under 10% of people who've had immunotherapy. But to put that into context, the really big trials that sort of prove the point for immunotherapy, at least as far as advanced melanoma is concerned, are about a third to half the size of that. And that 1,200, which is only going to grow, is about the size of a preventative melanoma trial, like the one that showed that pembrolizumab was potentially helpful in stage 2 melanoma and stage 3 and so forth. So these are really quite big numbers. And then it's also broken down by whether there was a family history, when people were diagnosed and so forth. So that's the build phase of this, if you like, and we've now finished that. I mean, it's still going on. We still have permission and a deal in place to write every 6 months to people who are newly diagnosed. So some letters will be going out later this month. And we're going to do that every 6 months to sort of catch up. And I think over time that will get us to the 20,000, which was our initial target. And so what we're now starting to do is to sort of think about, okay, well, that's great, we built it, we've got it at the scale that we think it'll be useful, what are we going to do with it? And so what we started to do is to feedback, and for those of you who are part of the project, you should have received some information, if you tick the relevant box to say keep sending me information, about what the people who are in MyMelanoma look like. And one of the first things we're trying to do is say, well, is this we'll ask you a couple of questions. Is this representative of the UK population? And the other question we wanted to ask was, how does MyMelanoma differ in terms of participants compared with the clinical trials that we're doing in our academic centres all the time? Turns out that's impossible to answer. So we identified the 12 biggest trials that we've done in academic centres around the UK over the last 20 years. And I wrote to all the principal investigators, including myself, saying, will you share this data? And mostly everybody wrote back and said, yes, but we don't have it. We can tell you their hospital number, we can tell you who they are, but we can't tell you where they live, we can't tell you what they had for breakfast or any of the other stuff that we've collected and so forth. And interestingly, and it shows you, it slightly proves the point about how I have a weird perspective, and my colleagues who do clinical trials, is we could tell you an awful lot about the cancer that patients had and rather less about people other than their age and gender. And if you're trying to say, well, okay, well, are we accessing harder to reach populations, people who live a long way away from hospitals and so forth, we simply couldn't answer that question. So at the moment, I wave my arms a lot and say, digital's better, it's more inclusive, but just don't ask me to prove it. Okay, and then as I said, the other question that we put out at the end of last year was what would our community like to see in terms of both information sharing and research as we move forward into that. So we sent out questionnaires to just over 15,000 people, and we had a 1 in 8 response rate, which I'm told for questionnaires is pretty good. And it was a one shot, we didn't badger people. And so you can see there what people thought was interesting. And then if we sort of fed that in to, well, what are the research areas that you think should be a priority, then this is what we got, with education and public awareness being the lowest of the choices we gave people, and treatment and early diagnosis and detection being the highest priorities with a range in between. So that's useful information in terms of guiding the projects that we should try to prioritize. And so, well, where are we going now? What are the things that we think are important for this year and next year? So, because of the way in which the digital recruitment was set up, we weren't allowed to sort of range far and wide with our diagnostic codes. So we had to focus on people with skin melanoma, rather than things like mucosal and ocular and so forth. So we need to reach out better to those populations. And Dan, my colleague who helps me run this, I know has spoken at the ocular melanoma meeting and other attempts to reach into groups who represent that better are going on. We need better reach into Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. There isn't really an analogous system for writing to everybody, but we've got strong representation on our researcher panel from Scotland in particular, slightly less so from Wales and not yet from Northern Ireland. But if we can get local champions who can help us to navigate ways of reaching potential participants there, I think that's hugely helpful. We're starting to get potential research questions from our community. And what we're going to be doing is feeding those out. We've got a participant panel who run their rule over them and knock them into shape before we send them out more widely to try and garner opinions as to how the research should be shaped and then to start to do that. And there are some things about lifestyle and so forth that are working their way through. We're looking harder at how we scale home sample collection. I think it's easy to take saliva, cheek cells for things like DNA. We can take small amounts of blood. If we need bigger amounts of blood, then we're going to have to partner up with places like Boots or Lloyd's Pharmacy and so forth. And we're, again, nicking ideas from our Future Health as to how we might do that so that we can take bigger sample sets to answer different questions whilst doing that near home, if not at home. And the other thing is, I'm quite old now. This is going to outlive me, I hope. Is to sort of reach out to researcher communities. And I'm very pleased to say that there are lots of young researchers with brimful of ideas and activity who want to see what they can do in partnership with our participants. They're in Manchester, they're in Norwich, they're in Inverness, they're in Leicester, they're in Cambridge, they're in Oxford. There's one in Aachen as well. She was in Manchester and then left. Our reach isn't quite that good yet. And so, from my point of view, I think my job is nearly over, which is to build this, to involve you, to invite you to continue to take part, and then to step back and let others take it forward as my Vespa runs out of fuel and grinds to a halt, and somebody else needs to take it over. So if you are interested and haven't yet joined, why the hell not? And you can put it right using that QR code and happy to take any questions. Or are they at the end?
At the end.
Okay, I'm not happy to take any questions just yet.
Thanks, Mark.